Friends, colleagues, and fellow citizens, thank you for being here. Let me begin plainly. I warned you something was coming, and now it's here. For years, I have been telling anyone who would listen that our economic system was heading toward a breaking point. This isn't prophecy, it isn't mystical foresight. It's the simple result of looking at history, looking at the numbers, and refusing to be lulled into the comforting illusions fed to us by the mainstream press and political leaders who profit from our ignorance. I told you that the immense and growing inequality in this country was not sustainable, that when the top 1% seizes more and more wealth, while the majority of working people struggle to make ends meet, something must give. And what do we see today? We see the rising costs of housing that lock an entire generation out of ownership. We see medical bills and student debt chaining millions to financial desperation. We see strikes and union drives popping up in industries that, until recently, never thought of themselves as battlefields of class conflict. What you are witnessing, my friends, is the very system straining under its contradictions. And I warned you about the politics that follow economic decline. When working people are squeezed, when their dreams are stolen, when they see no future for their children, anger rises. That anger can go in one of two directions. It can demand real systemic change, fairness, justice, democracy in the workplace, or it can be twisted into resentment, scapegoating, and authoritarian solutions. You are watching that struggle unfold in real time. The far right and the far left are both rising because the Tomb Center, the status quo, has failed. Now, here's the real question, and it is the hook you must not ignore. What will you do with this moment? Will you stand by as billionaires fly to space while you can't afford rent on Earth? Will you swallow the story that unmarket market knows best, even as it collapses again and again? Or will you demand something new? A system that values people over profit, a democracy that extends into our workplaces, and an economy designed not for the 1%, but for all of us. Economic inequality in the United States has reached a breaking point, and it is no longer an abstract topic reserved for academic journals or activist circles. It is lived experience for tens of millions of people every single day. The phrase cost of living crisis is not a slogan. It is the reality of families who work multiple jobs and still cannot cover basic needs. Housing costs have soared beyond the reach of ordinary workers. Renting an apartment in most major cities now consumes more than 40%, sometimes even 50% of a household's income, leaving little left for food, healthcare, or savings. Home ownership, once considered a hallmark of the American dream, is increasingly out of reach for young generations. Even those with decent jobs and steady incomes find themselves priced out, competing against cash-rich investors, hedge funds, and corporations that buy up entire neighborhoods and turn them into rental empires. The result is an economy where the basics, shelter, safety, and stability, are systematically denied to those who actually produce the wealth of this country. At the same time, debt has become the invisible chain binding millions to a life of financial insecurity. Student loans weigh down young professionals who were told that education was the key to success. Instead of opportunity, they inherit decades of repayment schedules that feel more like servitude than investment. Medical debt, a uniquely American phenomenon among wealthy nations, crushes families in their most vulnerable moments. A single accident, a diagnosis, or a hospitalization can mean financial ruin. Credit card debt, too, has ballooned as people turn to plastic not for luxury purchases, but to cover groceries, gas, and utilities when wages fail to keep up with inflation. These debts do not merely represent numbers on a balance sheet. They are daily stressors, stripping individuals of dignity and freedom while enriching financial institutions that profit from interest and penalties. The wage story is equally grim. For decades, productivity in this country has soared, but wages have remained largely stagnant. Workers produce more, create more value, and contribute more to corporate profits than ever before, yet their paychecks have not kept pace with the wealth they generate. The gap between worker productivity and compensation is a chasm, and that chasm is precisely where the billionaire class has built its fortunes. While CEOs collect salaries hundreds of times larger than their employees and shareholders enjoy record-breaking dividends, the people who actually make businesses run are told to tighten their belts, to be grateful for a job, and to accept precarious working conditions as if there were no alternative. What makes this crisis all the more intolerable is not simply the suffering it creates, but the juxtaposition of abundance with deprivation. The United States is one of the wealthiest nations in human history. Its corporations post quarterly profits in the billions. Its billionaires accumulate wealth so vast it cannot be meaningfully spent in 100 lifetimes. Yet, in the shadow of that opulence, millions live paycheck to paycheck, uncertain of how they will pay rent, afford childcare, or cover next month's bills. This stark contrast is not the result of natural forces or random chance. It is the consequence of deliberate policies, choices made by legislators, regulators, and business elites to privilege capital over labor, profits over people, and speculation over stability. The breaking point is not just economic, but also social and political. Communities fractured by inequality lose trust in institutions that seem incapable or unwilling to respond. People who feel betrayed by a system that constantly extracts from them without giving back are left searching for answers and often for someone to blame. When ordinary citizens work harder than ever and still fall behind, while a tiny fraction of the population lives in unimaginable luxury, anger becomes the inevitable outcome. And that anger is not going away. It fuels strikes, walkouts, and grassroots organizing. It also fuels cynicism, disillusionment, and susceptibility to demagogues who promise simple solutions but deliver deeper divisions. The signs of a system stretched to its limits are everywhere. Teachers take second jobs to survive. Nurses burn out not only from the weight of their labor, but from the impossible math of their household finances. College graduates move back in with their parents, not because they want to, but because even with a degree, independence is unaffordable. Meanwhile, headlines announce record profits for corporations in healthcare, real estate, and finance, the very sectors most responsible for squeezing working people. These are not isolated stories. They are the fabric of a national crisis. Inequality at this scale is unsustainable. Economies, like societies, depend on balance. When wealth accumulates too heavily at the top, when the majority can no longer participate in or benefit from growth, the system itself begins to falter. Demand dries up because ordinary people cannot afford to spend. Political stability erodes because citizens lose faith in representation that seems deaf to their struggles. What we are living through is not merely hardship for individuals, but the unraveling of the social contract that underpinned American prosperity in the mid-20th century. The breaking point is here, and ignoring it is no longer an option. The political center in the United States, once considered the stabilizing ground where compromise and consensus were possible, has collapsed under the weight of economic inequality, corporate influence, and public disillusionment. For decades, both major political parties promised stability and gradual improvement. They told voters that the system worked, that hard work would pay off, and that their children would live better than they did. But reality has shattered those assurances. Millions of Americans now look at their stagnant wages, mounting debts, unaffordable health care, and lack of opportunity, and they no longer believe in the promises that the center once sold so effectively. This erosion of faith has left a vacuum, and into that vacuum rush movements on both the left and the right, each claiming to speak for the frustration of the people, each channeling anger in profoundly different directions. The collapse of the center can be traced to its inability to deliver on even the most basic needs of working people. When the Democratic Party and the Republican Party alike preside over rising inequality, endless foreign wars, and financial crises that devastate ordinary citizens while bailing out the wealthy, the public begins to see little distinction between them. Rhetoric may differ, but the outcomes feel the same. Banks get saved, corporations get tax cuts, while families face eviction, job insecurity, and declining public services. This is why we increasingly hear that establishment politics is out of touch. It is not because people have suddenly grown more radical. It is because the middle ground has stopped functioning as a space where meaningful solutions are pursued. Instead, it has become a holding pattern for maintaining a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many. Into this vacuum, two distinct energies rise. On one side, there are movements demanding systemic reform, stronger unions, universal health care, student debt cancellation, public investment in housing, and democratic accountability in the workplace. These are movements rooted in the recognition that capitalism as it currently functions is unsustainable and unjust. They call for redistributing power and wealth, not as charity, but as a necessary restructuring of society to make it livable for the majority. On the other side, there are movements that redirect public anger towards scapegoats, immigrants, racial minorities, women, LGBTQ plus communities, or imagined conspiracies of cultural elites. Instead of targeting the economic system that has produced misery, these forces channel frustration into resentment and division, offering authoritarian figures who promise to restore order, tradition, or national greatness. What unites both directions, left and right, is their rejection of the political center. People no longer see moderation or bipartisanship as virtues because those approaches have failed to solve the problems that dominate everyday life. For decades, politicians in the center preached incremental change, insisting that progress was possible within the framework of the current system. Yet, for many Americans, conditions have worsened, not improved. Entire generations now feel cheated, told to believe in an American dream that is increasingly inaccessible. The loss of faith is not ideological alone, it is experiential. People live the consequences every time they open a medical bill, apply for housing, or compare their paycheck against the rising costs of basic necessities. The center's collapse also reveals itself in the cultural and media landscape. Traditional institutions, once trusted to provide balanced coverage or nonpartisan guidance, are now viewed with suspicion. Cable news networks, major newspapers, and mainstream political figures are dismissed as mouthpieces for corporate interests or partisan agendas. Social media amplifies alternative voices, some calling for radical democratic reform, others pushing reactionary agendas, but all operating outside the traditional boundaries of the center. The result is a fragmentation of political discourse. where consensus is no longer manufactured by a handful of elite institutions, but instead contested across countless digital platforms, rallies, and grassroots movements. This transformation carries immense consequences for the future of democracy. A functioning democracy depends on a common ground where compromise is possible and legitimacy is maintained. Without that ground, politics becomes polarized to the extreme, with each side treating the other as existential enemies. For some, this polarization is alarming. For others, it is a long overdue reckoning with a system that papered over deep injustices in the name of civility. The truth is that the collapse of the center signals not just division, but also the possibility of profound change. When the center no longer commands loyalty, society must confront questions long avoided. What kind of economy do we want? Who should hold power? Whose interests should government serve? The danger, however, lies in how that change unfolds. History offers many examples of societies where the collapse of a political center paved the way for authoritarianism as desperate populations turned to strong men who promised order and certainty. But history also shows that such moments can spark progressive transformations when workers, students, and communities organize to demand justice and equality. Which path the United States takes will depend on whether frustration is allowed to fester in resentment and fear, or whether it is channeled into constructive democratic renewal. What is certain is that the old promises of moderation, bipartisanship, and incremental reform no longer carry credibility. The center has failed, and its collapse has opened a new political era, one defined not by compromise, but by struggle over the very foundations of the system itself. Public anger is one of the most powerful forces in any society, and in the United States today, it is reaching levels that cannot be ignored. This anger is not abstract or manufactured out of thin air. It comes from daily struggles, from the pain of unmet promises, and from the visible contradiction between the wealth of the few and the hardship of the many. When workers see their wages stagnate while executives enjoy record-breaking bonuses, anger grows. When families must decide between paying rent or paying for health care, resentment builds. When young people inherit mountains of debt before they even begin their adult lives, frustration turns into despair. This collective mood of discontent is everywhere, and it is increasingly shaping our politics, our culture, and our future. The critical question is not whether anger exists, it undeniably does, but rather how that anger is directed and who has the power to shape it. In moments of social crisis, anger can be weaponized in different directions. On one path, anger can be turned into a force for progress, for building movements that demand justice, fairness, and democratic accountability. On another, it can be manipulated into resentment against scapegoats, dividing working people against each other while leaving the real sources of inequality untouched. History teaches us that both paths are possible, and that which one dominates depends on organization, leadership, and the narratives that take hold. Progressive movements see anger as a natural and justified response to systemic exploitation. They argue that the frustration people feel is not the fault of their neighbors, immigrants, or marginalized groups, but the result of an economic system that prioritizes profit over human need. For these movements, anger becomes the spark for collective action. Union drives, strikes, protests, and campaigns that aim to restructure power in the workplace and in society. Here, anger is not destructive, but transformative. It becomes the raw material out of which solidarity and progress are built. a force that exposes injustice and mobilizes people to demand change that serves the many rather than the few. But anger can also be distorted and weaponized in ways that are deeply destructive. Political leaders, media outlets, and interest groups have long known that frustration can be redirected away from systemic critique and toward convenient scapegoats. When a worker struggling to make ends meet is told that their real enemy is the immigrant taking their job, or the family receiving government assistance, or the activist demanding equality, their anger is deflected. Instead of challenging the corporate structures that exploit labor or the policies that enrich the wealthy, resentment is aimed at groups even more vulnerable than themselves. This manipulation of anger fractures solidarity and ensures that the system producing misery remains untouched. The powerful benefit twice over. They avoid accountability, and they divide the very people who might otherwise unite against them. The rise of authoritarian politics is one of the clearest examples of anger being harnessed in destructive ways. Strong men thrive in moments of crisis by offering simple answers to complex problems, directing blame outward while concentrating power inward. They appeal to fear and resentment, promising to restore order, tradition, or greatness. But their solutions rarely touch the underlying causes of discontent. Instead, they entrench inequality, silence dissent, and strip away democratic protections. Yet to those drowning in frustration, such promises can feel appealing, even necessary, when the political system has failed to deliver for decades. The danger of anger weaponized in this way is not only that it distracts from real solutions, but that it corrodes democracy itself. What makes this moment in the United States so volatile is that both of these paths, anger as a catalyst for progress and anger as a tool for division, are unfolding simultaneously. Workers are striking at levels not seen in decades, demanding better pay, conditions, and respect. Grassroots organizations are pushing for systemic reforms to healthcare, housing, and education. At the same time, reactionary forces are growing in strength, fueled by narratives that redirect frustration into culture wars, racial resentment, and suspicion of democracy itself. The struggle between these competing uses of anger will define the political landscape in the years ahead. Anger is inevitable when a system fails to meet the needs of its people, but inevitability does not determine direction. The challenge for those who want a more just society is to ensure that public anger is not wasted division, but harnessed towards solidarity and real change. That requires telling the truth about why people are suffering, exposing the structures that benefit from inequality, and offering credible paths toward a better future. Without such efforts, the anger that now fills this country risks being weaponized in ways that deepen inequality, erode democracy, and pit working people against one another. But if it is directed wisely, that same anger can be the foundation for renewal, a force that dismantles injustice and builds a society worthy of its people. The economic system in the United States is showing unmistakable signs of strain, and those strains are no longer confined to statistical charts or economic reports. They are visible in the daily lives of ordinary people. At the heart of this reality lies a deep contradiction. Capitalism promises opportunity, mobility, and prosperity for those who work hard. Yet the lived experience of millions tells a different story. The promise of endless growth and upward mobility collides with the reality of exploitation, job insecurity, and diminishing returns for labor. This contradiction is not new, but in recent years it has sharpened to a point that can no longer be ignored. What once could be explained away as temporary setbacks or isolated crises is now recognized by more and more people as a systemic problem. Strikes and labor actions are among the clearest signs of this tension. Workers across industries that for decades were considered stable or even privileged, such as education, healthcare, and technology, are now taking collective action to demand better treatment. Teachers in states across the country walk out of classrooms not only because of low pay, but because of underfunded schools and unsustainable working conditions. Nurses and hospital staff demand not only fair wages, but safe staffing levels that allow them to care for patients properly. Even in industries like film, journalism, and software engineering, workers are forming unions, challenging the notion that organized labor is a relic of the past. These movements reveal a fundamental truth. When a system fails to honor the dignity of its workforce, workers eventually fight back. The contradictions are equally clear in the housing market. While real estate developers and investors see record profits, ordinary families struggle to find affordable places to live. Housing, once considered a human necessity, has been transformed into a commodity for speculation. Investors buy entire blocks of homes not to live in them, but to flip them or rent them out at inflated prices. As a result, young families find themselves locked out of ownership, forced into renting at costs that eat away at their incomes. This is not simply a housing problem. It is a reflection of how capitalism treats basic needs as opportunities for profit rather than as rights to be secured for all. The contradiction is stark. A country with more than enough resources to house its population allows homelessness to rise alongside empty luxury apartments. Healthcare provides another powerful example. The United States spends more per capita on healthcare than any other advanced nation, yet millions remain uninsured or underinsured. For-profit insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations accumulate vast wealth while patients ration medication, delay care, or declare bankruptcy after medical emergencies. This is a contradiction that cuts to the heart of the system. How can a nation with such wealth and technological capacity tolerate a healthcare system that fails so many of its citizens? The answer lies in the structure of the system itself, where profit is prioritized over human well-being. Education, too, demonstrates the strain. The ideal that education serves as the ladder to opportunity has been undermined by crushing student debt and underfunded public institutions. Students who were told that a degree was the key to stability find themselves burdened with decades of repayments that delay homeownership, family formation, and savings. Meanwhile, elite private institutions amass endowments worth billions, further illustrating the imbalance between access and privilege. The contradiction here is unmistakable. Education is both more necessary than ever for economic survival, and yet more financially burdensome than ever for those who seek it. The financial sector sits at the center of these contradictions. Banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms thrive in an environment where instability for the many translates into profit for the few. Financial crises, which devastate working families, often result in bailouts and consolidations that strengthen corporate power. Stock buybacks reward shareholders while layoffs punish employees. The narrative that markets naturally regulate themselves collapses every time government steps in to rescue the very institutions that claim independence. What emerges is a system that privatizes gains while socializing losses, reinforcing the perception that the rules are written for the wealthy and against everyone else. What makes these contradictions unbearable is that they are no longer hidden. The public sees them clearly. Social media, independent journalism, and grassroots activism expose the hypocrisy in ways that were once impossible to suppress. Workers live stream their strikes. Tenants organize online to fight evictions. Patients share stories of medical bankruptcy that go viral. The myth that the system is working for everyone has been punctured, and the more people see, the less willing they are to accept the old explanations. When a system's promises clash so visibly with lived reality, pressure builds. That pressure can result in reform if addressed constructively, but if ignored, it leads to rupture. The strikes, union drives, and grassroots campaigns we see today are not anomalies. They are symptoms of a larger structural tension. Capitalism, in its current form, is failing to deliver on its most basic assurances. And as that failure becomes undeniable, the contradictions sharpen into crises that demand resolution. Whether through democratic transformation or deeper instability, the strain on this system will shape the future of American life. Every society eventually reaches moments when crisis can no longer be postponed, when the contradictions that have been building for decades erupt into open conflict. The United States today stands at precisely such a turning point. Rising inequality, the collapse of the political center, and the weaponization of public anger all converge to create a reality in which change is no longer optional. The question before us is not whether change will come, but how it will unfold and in whose interests it will be shaped. That is why moments of crisis must also be understood as moments of opportunity. They are dangerous, yes, but they also carry the possibility of breaking free from systems that have long held people back and building alternatives that better reflect the needs and values of the majority. Crisis exposes what has been hidden. For years, many were persuaded that the system was fundamentally sound, that its flaws were minor and could be patched with small reforms. But repeated economic crashes, staggering healthcare costs, unaffordable housing, and political paralysis have stripped away those illusions. People now see that the economy is not a neutral force operating in the background, but a set of rules and decisions designed by human beings. If it produces misery for the majority while delivering excess for the few, that is not an accident. It is the outcome of deliberate policy choices. This realization is destabilizing for those who benefit from the system, but empowering for those who suffer under it. When people recognize that human choices created their problems, they also begin to recognize that human choices can solve them. The opportunity lies in this awakening. As more people demand answers, they open space for ideas once dismissed as radical or unrealistic. Proposals for universal health care, debt cancellation, a living wage, stronger unions, and public investment in housing are no longer fringe demands. They are entering mainstream debates because lived reality has made them necessary. In past eras, crises have paved the way for significant reforms. The labor protections of the 1930s, the civil rights victories of the 1960s, and the social programs that emerged in the wake of mass pressure. None of these gains came easily, and none were handed down from above. They were won because ordinary people seized the opportunities presented by crisis to demand better. But opportunities are never guaranteed. History also shows that moments of instability can be captured by forces that seek to entrench power, concentrate wealth further, and suppress democracy. In the absence of organized progressive responses, anger can be redirected into authoritarian solutions. Leaders who promise strength and certainty can channel crisis into division using fear to justify restrictions on freedoms and scapegoating vulnerable populations. This is why the stakes of the current moment are so high. The same conditions that make transformative reform possible also make destructive regression possible. Which path society takes will depend on the strength, clarity, and persistence of the movements that rise to meet the crisis. The question then becomes, what will people do with this moment? Will they allow frustration to be fragmented and absorbed by politics that maintain the status quo, or will they recognize the power they hold when they act collectively? Will they accept narratives that blame their neighbors for their hardships, or will they demand accountability from the structures that systematically create inequality? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the choices being made in workplaces, communities, and streets across the country every day. Each strike, each protest, each organizing effort is part of the larger struggle to shape the outcome of this crisis. What makes this moment particularly potent is the growing sense that time is running out. Climate change, technological disruption, and geopolitical instability add layers of urgency to an already fragile system. Young generations who face the dual burden of inheriting debt and environmental collapse are less willing to accept promises of gradual reform. They are demanding systemic change not in the distant future, but now. Their energy and impatience reflect not recklessness, but a rational response to conditions that threaten their very survival. Their demands for bold action are not distractions from the crisis. They are expressions of the only realistic path forward. Crisis brings clarity. It forces people to ask what kind of society they want to live in and what values they are willing to defend. It strips away the comfort of gradualism and confronts everyone with the reality that standing still is no longer an option. The opportunity lies in seizing this clarity, in refusing to be paralyzed by fear, and in turning justified anger into constructive power. If enough people step into that opportunity, they can transform the structures that have long dictated their lives. If they fail to do so, others will seize the moment for themselves, and the outcome will be far less just. The inevitability of change is already upon us. The challenge now is to shape it into something that reflects the dignity, needs, and aspirations of the majority rather than the narrow interests of the few. Let me close with this. History is not kind to those who bury their heads in the sand. Every empire, every system that thought itself eternal, discovered the hard way that decline comes swiftly once its people lose faith. I warned you something was coming, and now it's here, but it's not too late. The crisis before us is also an opportunity. If we act with clarity and courage, we can build an economy that truly reflects our values, our dignity, and our shared humanity. The question, my friends, is not whether change is coming. The question is, will we shape it or will it shape us?